Hey everybody! So I have to admit to you, I'm really disappointed that I can't give this lecture in person. That's because international development and specifically international development ethics is my area of expertise. It's actually what I wrote my dissertation on in graduate school. I devoted over 6 years of my life to thinking about these issues and conducted tons of field work in Mali and Uganda in order to try to get at answering the question that we're going to go over in this video. So all that to say, I'm sorry I can't have this conversation with you in person, but I hope that you will find this subject just as interesting and also difficult and challenging as I do. So I have posted a couple links for you in this module to a bunch of infographics on global poverty. In addition to that, there's an article about ethnocentrism and racism and international development. And lastly, I also linked the module, one of the pages in the module, to a video game that you're going to play. It's similar to Oregon Trail, but it's called Third World Farmer. So you pretend to be a farmer in a rural village in sub-Saharan Africa, and you have to make strategic decisions and choices about what kind of food to attempt to cultivate and grow, what kind of animals to purchase, and so on and so forth. And with that video, I hope that you'll come to a better understanding of what some of the impediments are to international development, and specifically getting out of poverty if you are living in a rural part of the developing world. In addition to that, I just want to give you a better idea of where the globe stands right now. To what extent is development uneven? And by development, I just mean economic prosperity, well-being, livelihood, etc. So here are a couple statistics that I think are really illuminating. The first is, if you make more than $52,000 a year, not in the United States, but in the world, you are technically in the global 1%. That means that you make more money than 99% of the world's population if you make $52,000 a year or more, right? That is a really astounding, extraordinary statistic, at least in my mind. I think that you'll probably agree with that. Secondly, half of the world lives off of less than $2.50 a day. I went to Starbucks this morning. I think I spent like $7 on a stupid coconut latte and banana nut bread, right? So I just cannot imagine living off of less than even $20 a day for that matter, right? Thirdly, 1/4 of the world lives without electricity. You can imagine how difficult it would be to do your homework, all of the things that you do for entertainment on the weekend, how difficult it is to just go about your daily life when your electricity turns off. Well, 25% of the world's population lives that way every single day. And lastly, 3.1 million children die every single year simply because they don't have enough food to eat. Now, we know for a fact that farmers in the agricultural industries all over the world produce enough food for everybody in the world to consume. However, not all of that food gets to children in the world. So there are all of these questions that we can ask within the subfield of international development, which is usually housed under the subdiscipline within political science, international relations. The first question that a lot of people ask is, well, why is it that the United States is so economically prosperous? And on the other hand, Africa, many countries in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America are doing so poorly. Another question we might ask is more philosophical, and that question might be, do we, as Americans, as the affluent, the rich, have an obligation to help people in poor countries? Or do rich countries and their governments, like the United States government, have a responsibility to help poor countries? I'm sure you already know this, but the United States, along with a lot of European countries, most of the affluent countries in the world, do give money directly to poor countries in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. Third, we might also ask, what are the best ways, if we agree that it's important to help poor people, what are the most effective ways to help poor people? Some might argue that education is key. So if we build a bunch of primary schools in rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa, then children will be educated, they'll start businesses, and then that country will develop. Some people might argue that we have to address health concerns before we even worry about education. So every child needs to be vaccinated. Every child needs to have enough food to eat. We need to ensure that when children get malaria, they get the proper treatment. Some people might argue that Africa is underdeveloped because it doesn't have enough roads. There's not enough infrastructure. And so therefore, if we build more roads and infrastructure, then Africans will be able to trade more effectively with one another, more efficiently, and Africa will develop. Okay, so lots of questions there as well, and a lot of debate that goes on over that particular question in development. But this last question is development intervention? In other words, when rich people or rich countries help poor people in poor countries, is that even ethical? In other words, when an American goes to Uganda in order to build a primary school, or if they give money to a family so that they can pay for their child to be treated with malaria because they contracted it in Ghana, in a rural village where they live, is that somewhat ethnocentric, right? Earlier on in the semester, you guys read about the Marxist critiques of international relations theoretical paradigms. Particularly, you read that Wallerstein article. Wallerstein talks about how there's a core, there's a semi-periphery, and there's also a peripheral. And these structural, these kind of class-based inequalities in the international system are a consequence of colonization and imperialism. Most of Africa was colonized by the British, the Portuguese, the Belgians, or the French. The only country in Africa to have never been colonized is Ethiopia, in fact. That historical legacy may still have an impact on Africa today, and as such, it might be that wealthy people or wealthy nations from the quote-unquote Western worlds, in other words, Europe or the United States, are trying to help, but they might be doing more harm than good, okay? So this is the question that I focused on, in fact, in my research. This is what my dissertation was on. I want to point out to you one thing, and that is that I came up with this research question not just out of thin air, but I came up with this question because it is, how do I say, an issue, a problem with development that I confronted myself in my early 20s as I was interning for, working for, or consulting for various nonprofit organizations that were trying to do development work in rural parts of Africa. So if you look at a latter part of the module, you'll see that I linked an article for you about this Barbie Savior Instagram account. This is a real Instagram account. You can look it up yourself. Barbie Savior has almost 200,000 followers. And if you look at the bio, it's satirical, okay? So this account is intended to make fun of white women who go to sub-Saharan Africa and claim to want to help poor people, particularly usually poor children, and in effect, right, don't really do anything worthwhile. What this account is trying to get at is that a lot of people go to sub-Saharan Africa maybe to bolster their social media presence, or maybe because they genuinely think that it's the right thing. But if we read in between the lines, there's a lot of implicit racism here. So if you look at the bio, it says Jesus, adventures, Africa, 2 worlds, 1 love, babies, beauty, not qualified, called, 20 years young. It's not about me, but it kind of is, hinting at the fact that she goes to Africa to help, not really because she cares maybe, but because she's a little bit egocentric and narcissist. So you'll see there's these pictures of her with a hippo, going to the bathroom, and kind of typical what we call Nyegan in rural parts of Mali. You get the picture, so on and so forth. So here's the reason why I wanted to focus on this particular issue in the last part of the class and in this module. If you think to all of the movies or any of the depictions of Africa you have yourself seen throughout your life, or what you were even introduced to during your K through 12 years, most of the depictions of Africa were pretty negative. I'm guessing you've seen commercials from World Vision with Sarah McLachlan singing in the arms of the angels in the background, and there's this poor, emaciated African child who is incredibly malnourished or has parasites. There's flies on him, right? So when we think Africa, we think poverty, right? I can't tell you too how many people have told me that Africa is a country. I'm sure most of you know Africa is a continent and not a country. But here are some things about Africa that you maybe didn't know. Did you know that Rwanda has the highest level of highest percentage of female politicians in the entire world? 63% of its legislative is women. If you look at the United States Congress is only a little bit over 20% female. Overall, Africans vote way more than Americans do. Voter turnout rates are around 70% continent-wide. In the United States, during presidential election years, we usually can't get above 55% voter turnout rate. In addition to that, Africa is a little bit more environmentally conscious, maybe not by choice, but more environmentally conscious than the rest of the world. Okay, only emits about 4% of the world's total carbon dioxide emissions. If it wasn't for Africa, we wouldn't have certain forms of mathematics. Jazz came from West Africa. We have coffee because of Africa, shea butter. The batteries in your cell phones, uranium. Uranium can be found in parts of East Africa. Did you know that Mali in West Africa was one of the wealthiest empires in the world in the 13th century due to the gold and salt trade? And lastly, we have some evidence, can't confirm it, but we have some evidence that people from Ghana sailed to the North American continent well before Columbus or even the Vikings made the trek. Okay, so Africa isn't all bad. Right? A lot of these stereotypes come from the ways in which media portrays Africa. So this is why I've assigned to you a reading from a literature labeled post-development. I want you to think more about these issues. It seems fairly obvious that rich nations have an obligation to help people in the developing world. But is it ethnocentric? Is it paternalistic to think that we here in the United States live better lives than people in rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa? Or is it necessary for us to assist people in poor areas? Is there maybe a way to do it in a way that is less ethnocentric or paternalistic?